The Second World War would be an incredible learning curve for armed forces the world over. No one had a clear understanding how the various aspects of the conflict would play out. They say no plan survives contact with the enemy, and that was never truer than at the start of World War II. One area that did not have much importance put upon it at the beginning of 1939 was the air arm that would be in direct contact with the German U-boats and commerce raiders. This was interesting, as the Great War had shown that England was indeed quite isolated under the right conditions. The U-boats had first become a serious menace in 1917, and the Kriegsmarine was again showing interest in these boats. While it is true that Germany was largely focused on the big ships, Karl Dönitz was placed in charge of Germany's submarines, and he understood very well just how effective a force they could be. Germany had not been able to catch up to the Allies in naval strength, even with the ignoring of the treaties. The sheer time it took to create a large capital ship meant that the only area where Germany could create a force multiplier was with submarines. Even then, Dönitz had just over 20 ocean-going Type 7Cs. Surface vessels in 1939, they had the Gneisenau, the Scharnhorst, the Deutschland, Scheer, and Graf Spee. 8 cruisers and 22 destroyers. They were outnumbered by Britain, which had 12 battleships, 3 battlecruisers, aircraft carriers, 64 cruisers, and more than 180 destroyers. The German ships were modern, whereas some of the Royal Navy ships were older designs, and because of England's empire, they were spread across the globe. In 1939, Coastal Command was relegated to a pretty low priority, even though Britain being an island meant that there was a lot of coast, as well as the fact that the countries were not self-sufficient and relied heavily in times of war with outside commerce for survival. Coastal Command had 16 squadrons, which amounted to around 260 aircraft, but only one of these was equipped with the Lockheed Hudson Mark I. Avro Anson Mark Is were a slow aircraft with only a range of around 400 kilometres. The vast area of the ocean as well as a poor weapons load made the type unsuitable for effective maritime patrolling, yet the type stayed in service till 1941. 3 squadrons would have the Sunderland, which would prove to be an excellent aircraft and the only long-range aircraft in Coastal Command at that time. There was also the submarine Stranraer and Sarro London flying boats. They had 3 areas that they were responsible for. These included the western approaches, the North Sea and Channel, which were expecting a lot of traffic, and lastly, the waters around Scotland. The mandate was to offer convoy protection, recon, protecting the sea communications and engaging the enemy. The low range of some of the aircraft led to Royal Navy submarines also sharing the reconnaissance duties, though in reality this was not an unreasonable thing for submarines to be doing. As the war progressed into its opening weeks, the call upon Coastal Command increased greatly. Patrols, reconnaissance, protection of convoys and fishing boats, and Royal Navy minesweepers, as well as engaging the enemy at any opportunity. This was made altogether harder by the poor options that Coastal Command had in regards to weapons. 50-pound and 100-pound anti-submarine bombs, which were unreliable and low yield. The 450-pound depth charge, the Mark VII, was a 1918 design. The bomb sites in all but the Hudson were unsuitable for hunting U-boats and ships. They had no aerial radar at that point and instead relied upon their sight and binoculars for finding the enemy. The U-boats would soon make their presence felt. In September they sank 26 ships, October nearly 75,000 tons of shipping lost, nearly 20,000 in November. The Royal Navy lost the Courageous and the Royal Sovereign to submarine attacks. It soon became clear that dealing with the U-boats would be one of Coastal Command's most pressing tasks, yet success against the underwater menace was rare. The 100-pound bombs were causing more damage to the planes than the boats. The low-level drops were placing the more fragile aircraft sometimes within the blast. And on the 5th of September 1939, an Anson was forced to ditch after attacking a U-boat and damaging itself in the process. By July 1940, the total squadrons to Coastal Command had been increased, as well as the addition of a better aircraft, the Bristol Beaufort Mark I torpedo bomber. Fleet Air Arm was a smaller force than Coastal Command. It had 36 Skua Mark IIs in service, as well as the surprisingly good Fairey Swordfish. The latter, amounted around 140, were available for operations. They also had some Fairey Sea Fox and the excellent Supermarine Walrus. Although they were not a large force, they were involved in some capacity to several larger and important operations, including the capture of the German supply ship Altmark, the operations surrounding the Graf Spee, and strikes against Narvik. Attacking large ships was a dangerous game, and 8 out of 10 skuas were lost attacking the Scharnhorst. It wasn't exactly plain sailing for the Luftwaffe either. They did have a Commander Fleet Air Arm, which included around 220 aircraft. These included the Dornier Do-18D, Heinkel HE-60Cs, Heinkel HE-115A1s, Heinkel's HE-59Bs, and the Arado AR-196 floatplane. Although they had the aircraft, they were not entirely sure how to utilise them best. A decision was made to create an anti-shipping bomber force. Heinkel HE-111s and Junkers Ju-88s would lead strikes against various naval targets with mixed success. One raid to Scapa Flow did cause heavy damage to the HMS Iron Duke. One area the Germans did utilise was mining. HE-59s were used initially, but Do-17s and HE-111s were also used. The British worked hard to find countermeasures, but for a time more ships were lost to mines than to the U-boats. As 1940 came around, the naval aircraft would play an important role in Norway, and they would receive the infamous Fokker Wolf 200 Condor. This big 4-engined aircraft had good range and carried up to 5 SC-250 bombs. It would conduct reconnaissance and conduct low-level strikes on shipping. Though early on they did not have much more than 10 on strength, and the force was supplemented by HE-111H4s. The fall of France had done more than just taking an ally out of the war and lost the Allies a foothold in Europe. It also gave the Germans airfields that were much closer to Britain and the Atlantic, as well as direct ports for the U-boats. With better coordination and reconnaissance, the U-boats started to operate in wolf packs. Night and surface attacks were also taking heavy losses on Allied shipping. In the opening months of 1941, only a handful of U-boats had been sunk by Allied aircraft. Britain was being choked to death, and it became clear that survival was now a very difficult thing if the U-boats could not be dealt with.